Good evening to all. Welcome this evening. My name is Douglas Henry, and it's my great honor to serve as Dean of our Honors College. Baylor University's Honors College encompasses a community of 1,400 undergraduates of bold aspiration and keen academic ability. Many of them are here tonight. It's so good to see you, our students. Our full-time faculty and staff of 55 teach, mentor, advise, support, and inspire these students whose studies span more than 90 different majors across Baylor's campus. We're working better than ever to serve these students in beautifully renovated spaces. This room among them, in honor of philanthropic support of a wonderful family, renamed the Willett Family Reading Room. And it's a joy to be here. This is our break-in evening here for a largish public event. This renovated facility, Alexander and Memorial Hall, and the first and second floors of Draper Academic Building across the Founders Mall provide for us a home for the first time for the whole Honors College at the historic heart of Baylor's campus. We're very proud of this investment on behalf of excellent undergraduate education the university has made. And so on behalf of the Honors College and Baylor University, welcome indeed. Since 1994, that's before many of you were born, Frank and Darba Jackson, along with their family and friends, boldly imagined and generously supported an annually celebrated lecture series bearing the name of Laura Blanche Jackson. A biography that tells some of her story is included in your program, and I hope you'll read it, marvel at her, remember her. In gathering this evening, we remember Laura's vibrant, engaged mind, her shining character, her bright hopes for marshaling insight and goodwill on behalf of resolving our world's great challenges. Tonight's speaker, about whom you'll hear more momentarily, joins 3 decades of the best and brightest who've come to help us wrestle intelligently with matters that matter. As that first page or so of your program relates, Laura cared. She cared for her family, she cared for her sorority sisters and friends around campus, and she cared for the world around her, whether near or far, down the street or around the globe. She was an exemplification of Baylor's mission, in which we educate men and women for worldwide leadership and service by integrating academic excellence and Christian commitment within a caring community. Laura's family, through this lectureship, remembers a precious daughter now with the Lord, and Laura's friends likewise celebrate and honor the good things of her life. She was blessed, and we have been blessed by God's grace through her. So again, I say, welcome. Momentarily, my colleague, David Corey, professor of political science in the honors program, will come to introduce our distinguished speaker. Before that, Carly Jackson, chaplain of Kappa Kappa Gamma, the sorority in which Laura Jackson found a special place of belonging, will come forward to offer an invocation, followed by Ella Cork, Kappa president, who will bring her special word of welcome to Laura's family and special guests. So Carly, if you would come right on up, and then followed immediately thereafter by Ella. Thank you.
I invite you all to pray with me as we enter this event. Dear Lord, we just come to you grateful today, Lord. First, just grateful for this beautiful space, this amazing place that we get to gather and all come together and just hear about the life of Laura Jackson and honor her life. We're just grateful for her parents to continue her legacy, Lord, and for all the people who have been committed to this lecture every single year. And we just come to you with gratitude, Lord, for the gifts that you give us. Laura Jackson was so intelligent and vibrant, and those are gifts that come from you. So we're grateful for that. And I pray that you just open our minds and open our hearts to the amazing message that we're going to hear today and what we're going to learn from Jeff. And I pray that you just you bless us all with this night. We're grateful for Laura and as she's gleaning down on us from heaven. And in your name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Ella Cork, and as president of Kappa Kappa Gamma, it is my honor to welcome you to the annual Laura Jackson Lecture. I would like to express my gratitude to Laura's parents, Dr. Frank and Darba Jackson, for making this event possible. Laura was an outstanding and respected member of the Baylor community who gave much of her time to activities and organizations on campus. She was a contributing member of Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority and the Student Foundation. She was loved by all who knew her. It is with joy that we remember Laura this evening. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the special people who are with us. If you would please stand when your name or group is called. Laura's parents, Dr. Frank and Darba Jackson. Other family members of Laura's, including Meg, who is a senior Kappa. Friends of the Jackson family who have traveled from Longview and other places to be with us, as well as all of Laura's Kappa sisters, including our advisor, Tommy Lou Davis, who served as Laura's advisor. Stand up, Kappas. Yes, thank you, girls. Thank you all for coming. It means so much to the Jackson family to have each of you there to honor Laura and her legacy. We hope you all enjoy your evening.
I'm David Corey. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend Jeff Polet. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Dr. Polet and I have been friends for many years. We first met on the lecture circuit in Washington State during a very hot summer, and he gave a brilliant talk on the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. I'll never forget it. And afterwards, I thought, since our work is in a similar area, maybe he would be familiar with my work. So afterwards, I went up and introduced myself to see if he would say he knew my work. He said, "Are you related to Dr. Elizabeth Corey?" And I'm going to get him back for that. Dr. Polet went to Calvin College. He did his master's in CUA at the Catholic University of America. He wrote on the German thinker Hans-Jörg Gadamer for his dissertation. He's been a longtime professor at Hope College, a very beloved teacher, a brilliant writer of political essays. He has since made a career change, and he is director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the President R. Ford Foundation. I respect Jeff so much for his political sobriety at a time when soberness is not the first word that comes to mind as we read people's political opinions. In fact, I was asked not too long ago to contribute an essay to the journal Civil Discourse on what was called a coalition of the sensible, and I got to sketch out a political theory that I thought was sober and sensible. And I wanted to name some people that I thought were of this ilk. So I thought, well, of course, I'm going to mention my wife, Dr. Elizabeth Corey. Got you back. And then secondly, of course, Dr. Jeff Polet for his sound political mind. You'll see his essays all over the place. He writes for First Things. He's been very active with the Front Porch Republic. You'll see him writing for the Acton Institute. And when you have a chance, pick up what you read and read it. And you'll see a person whose political theory is extremely well grounded in the constitutional founding of this country, but which is also capable of making adjustments for the present challenges that we face. It's my pleasure to introduce a very wise political thinker. I recommend you listen astutely. Please welcome Jeff Polet. You don't need this.
Can you hear me okay? Is it working? All right, excellent. Thank you, David. Thank you, Doug, for the invitation. Thank you to the Jackson family for endowing this and allowing me to come speak tonight. And thank you to all of you for coming here. If you're expecting to hear what I think about the upcoming election, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not going to have a whole lot to say about it. Perhaps during the Q&A, you might want to go into it a little bit. But what I'm trying to do in this speech is pull out the camera lens and take a bigger view of what's going on in our politics and how our leadership class is reflecting a much longer and deeper trend in political life than what we're accustomed, how we're accustomed to thinking about it. And I have put in there also a number of things that I hope speak particularly to the young people in this audience. You know, if you're 18 years old now, according to the political socialization theory, your political views become kind of rounded when you're about 12 or 13 years old. Which means that you were kind of coming into a mode of political awareness in the election of 2016. So good luck to you if that's kind of the imprint memory that you have about American politics. But I've put into the speech a number of ideas that I think transcend just our politics and hopefully can help you think about what it means to live a good life. As I was reading up on the Jackson's daughter, Laura, finding out online what I could find out about her, one phrase stuck out to me. She had a well-integrated personality, it said. And I think that is a wonderful testimony to her family, her friends, and to Baylor University to produce young persons with well-integrated personalities. And so hopefully the speech contributes to that in some ways, gives you some things to think about. And with that, I am going to launch into my prepared remarks. And you know, they might be a little unusual or provocative, but I hope that sparks some conversation afterwards. Among the advantages of monarchy, not having to live through quadrennial elections with their interminable campaigns ranks high on the list. A monarchy also gets subjects off the hook. We didn't choose this person, so can't really be held accountable for his or her conduct. Granted, a system of hereditary succession can produce bad results, but it's not as if democracy has such a great record these days. The title of this lecture, Getting What We Deserve, refers to an old saw in political science. People tend to get the kind of leaders that they deserve. As a political scientist, I often get asked, there are 340 million people in this country. Is this really the best we can do? To which I typically answer, well, we're the ones voting for them. So when we think about getting what we deserve, we might well ask, who is this we? What are we getting? And why do we deserve it? Too narrow a focus on politics occludes our ability to answer these questions. We capitulate to the tyranny of the moment or think that everything hinges on the result of this, yet again, most important election of our lifetime. This is the 5th straight most important election of my lifetime, by the way. I think we are better served by taking a much broader view, asking what trends have led to the diminution of leadership. As the wise man said, when small men cast long shadows, it means the sun is going down. After visiting America, Alexis de Tocqueville, whose name will come up repeatedly through this address, confessed that he saw in America more than America. He had witnessed the advent of the democratic revolution that would soon sweep over the whole globe. Reflecting back on the events of the past 7 centuries, he realized how all events had contributed to democracy's benefit. Everywhere you saw the various incidents in the lives of peoples turned to the profit of democracy, he wrote. All men aided it by their efforts, those who had in view contributing to its success, and those who did not think of serving it. Those who fought for it, and even those who declared themselves its enemies. All were pushed pell-mell along the same path, and all worked in common, some despite themselves, others without their knowledge, blind instruments in the hands of God. His observations extended to the problem of leadership in a democracy. Upon my arrival to the United States, he reflected, I was struck with surprise to find out how common merit was among the governed and how uncommon it was among the governing. Today, it is a constant fact in the United States that the most outstanding men are rarely called to public office. And we are forced to recognize that this has occurred as democracy has gone beyond all former limits. Clearly, the race of American statesmen has grown significantly smaller over the past half century. He wrote that in 1835. Democratic countries, he wrote, have a hidden instinct to keep its best and brightest out of positions of leadership. Americans do not fear great talents, he thought, but neither do they respect them. As Chancellor Kent observed, the fittest men would probably have too much reservedness of manners and severity of morals to secure an election resting on universal suffrage. I'm going to assume that there is a crisis of leadership, not only in this country, but throughout the whole Western world, and that most of you think similarly. This shared sense results in part from our focus. When we think of leaders, we tend to think of leaders of political bodies. I want to distract us from such thinking, but only after I've indulged it. Our inability to assess our leaders results from another problem. The word has largely ceased to mean anything. I run a leadership forum, but I'm not quite sure what I do. That's actually funny. So, thank you. Yeah. Every college in the country is producing leaders, forcing us to ask the obvious question as to where the followers are coming from. Is this part of our divide, that we assume college graduates are leaders and that makes them somehow superior to people who didn't go to college? Nor do we ask where leaders are needed or what specific skills they need or how those skills can be best identified. There are, for example, nearly 2 million nonprofits in America that require persons to occupy positions of authority. Does a college education prepare individuals to hold such posts? And does the absence of a college education make them unfit? Do we even know what capacities people need to have and whether these can be taught at all? These questions intensify when we alter the scale and scope of the exercise of authority. The effects of bad leadership on a small scale are rather benign and affect relatively few people. But when you attempt to project leadership onto a larger scale, the consequences grow in significance. This becomes especially true in politics because the essence of politics involves the resolution of conflict through coercive means. And such conflict is baked into the human condition. Our Constitution, for example, is a compromise document written for a contentious people. Part of what makes the Constitution work for as long as it has is that it tries to channel this contentiousness into energetic action. And that end is largely accomplished through executive power. Energy in the executive, Alexander Hamilton wrote, is the very definition of good government. And so we tend to equate the health of the country with the quality of our most visible leaders. And in this day and age, that means the presidency. Throughout the first 51 of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison present us with a sober view of human nature: ambitious, self-interested, contentious, uncharitable, driven by passion, and prideful. One wonders how we could ever produce good leaders. But from paper 52 forward, Madison and Hamilton acknowledge that we need good leaders. In number 57, Madison wrote, "The aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first, to obtain for rulers men who possess wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. And in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous while they continue to hold the public trust." Republican systems seem to assume the following: good leaders will be persons of high character and sound judgment, and as such can be trusted with the enormous powers invested in them. They will also be incorruptible, so the holding of power will have no corrosive effect on their character. Madison reminded us that the process of identifying and maintaining elected officials in virtue depends on the connection the leader has with the people. And this is really the central point of my address, the connection between the leader and the people. But, he wrote, if those ties which bind the representative to his constituents are ever weakened, then the very possibility of Republican government becomes unthinkable. Our current crisis of leadership results directly from the loosening of those bonds. not only in our political institutions, but in all our institutions. We increasingly feel distant from those in positions of authority, who seem to us too often to be operating with a set of interests contrary to the good as we understand it, or to the well-being of the institutions they run. Madison believed that the people would only select those whose reputation for good character could secure the esteem and support of the community, and once in power would remain scrupulously impartial to the rights and pretensions of every class and every description of citizens. In other words, they would attend to the good of the whole and not to any particular part of it. One of the main concerns Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike shared about the Republican system was whether it could survive if its leadership class ever governed in its own interest or governed in the interests of one particular segment or class of society. Under such circumstances, resentment, anger, and unrest would soon begin percolating through the system. In 1930, the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset published The Revolt of the Masses, wherein he addressed, after the First World War, the fragile nature of Western civilization. The rising tide of mass democracy, he thought, had put Western civilization in further peril because common people didn't understand what it takes to maintain a civilization. This, he thought, was the purview of the elites, who alone, because of their superior acculturation and learning, were responsible for upholding civilizational standards. Mass men, Ortega claimed, live as they always are. They combine radical ingratitude with unlimited possibility, driven purely by material instinct. Mass man rejects courtesy, truthfulness, and above all, respect or esteem for superior individuals. Seeking only comfort and material advantage, mass man has no idea how to maintain the civilization whose largesse he consumes every day. In 1995, the American social critic Christopher Lasch published The Revolt of the Elites. He begins this book with a dark catalog of our misfortunes, which sound eerily familiar 30 years later. Quote, Americans are much less sanguine about the future than they used to be, and with good reason. The decline in manufacturing and the consequent loss of jobs, the shrinkage of the middle class, the growing number of the poor, the rising crime rate, the flourishing traffic in drugs, the decay of the cities, the bad news goes on and on. No one has a plausible solution to these intractable problems, and most of what passes for political discussion doesn't even address them. Fierce ideological battles are fought over peripheral issues. Elites who define the issues have lost touch with the people. The unreal, artificial character of our politics reflects their isolation from the common life, together with a secret conviction that the real problems are insoluble. End quote. If Lasch is correct, and I believe he is, this severing of the connections between our ruling elites and the common people resides at the heart of our current political crisis, not only in our country, but in the West at large. One of the peculiar features of our contemporary landscape is the repeated expression that our democracy is under threat and needs preserving. I always wonder, is it really democracy that is under threat? Or is it the interests of the ruling class that are under threat? And they call it democracy. Is it democracy that is under threat? Or is democracy itself the threat? What exactly is meant when somebody uses that phrase? All too often, it becomes a shorthand mechanism for dismissing the claims of those with whom one disagrees. Simply proclaim their views as a threat to democracy, and the argument is over. Lasch argued that the problems of contemporary democracy resulted from the corruption of our governing elites, who increasingly came to see those over whom they governed as their inferiors. According to Lasch, one of the key factors in this contemptuous dismissal was the devaluing of manual labor. The elite might acknowledge that such labor is necessary, but they would never deign to do it themselves or to regard the persons who do perform such tasks as capable of participating in governance. Managing the common people becomes essential to maintaining elite power, such managing largely accomplished through the control of money and information. The great division in society, Lash thought, is that between people who spend their lives in the presence of real things and those who spend their lives in the world of symbols and abstractions. The former are propertied and meet a world that offers them resistance and forces them to deal with the consequences of their failures. And the others inhabit a world they imagine to be frictionless and where the consequences of failure can be, through policy manipulation, avoided. Those who live in the world of real things learn self-reliance and to take responsibility for their actions, while their superiors who live in the world of symbols seek to secure permanent sinecures for themselves and hide behind regulations. The advent of a centralized bureaucratic government across the Western world thus exacerbates the distance separating the rulers from the ruled. Tocqueville commented on how political centralization would increase rent-seeking behavior, observing that, I'm quoting him in part here, the excessive desire for public office is a great social evil that destroys within each citizen the spirit of independence and spreads throughout the entire body of the nation a venal and servile temper. Furthermore, he continued, it suffocates the manly virtues and creates only an unproductive activity and agitates the country without making it fruitful. One of the biggest problems in any Republican form of government is that representatives, once distant from their constituents, may soon represent a different group or interest, or become a separate interest in their own right. When political leaders begin to privilege the interests of a particular group against those of another, or against the common good, they invite a negative response. Tocqueville worried that the opening of office in a democratic society would make politics more unstable and inexpert, but also make it more contentious. Ambition, having no outlet except in the administration alone, would devolve the government to the task of satisfying, with limited means, desires that multiply without limits. He continues, you have to be well aware that of all the peoples of this world, the one most difficult to contain and to lead is a people of place seekers. Whatever the efforts made by its leaders, they can never satisfy such a people. And you must always fear that will finally overturn the constitution of the country and change the face of the state, solely for the need to open up new positions. Democracy, he claimed, substituted for the static hierarchies of the pre-modern world a dynamic hierarchy where those lower on the scale would, driven by resentment, try to cut those on the top down to size, while those on the top would zealously guard their place, which they would pass on to their progeny by isolating their offspring in exclusive institutions. This is why the more elite the institution, the greater the guilt about privilege. Democracy, Tocqueville believed, thus introduced competition between the classes in place of the mutual dependence of aristocratic ages. Unlike the noblesse oblige of the old system, the new one would, Tocqueville predicted, rip apart the social fabric by placing the classes in perpetual conflict with each other. The continued existence of social and economic classes, the relations now marked by envy and resentment on one side and contempt and smugness on the other, would place the democratic experiment on a shaky foundation. And the tremors of that would be felt by all, even if they weren't fully cognizant of how the ground was constantly shifting under their feet. In an egalitarian democracy, anyone enjoying social or economic success must answer to those less successful, who will have to justify to themselves their lower status, and will thus in turn attribute the success of others to either dumb luck or hidden vice. Comparison would rob citizens of comity. This essential insight of Tocqueville's extended long-standing worries considering the inherent instability of democratic regimes. In the aristocracies of old, people might have gotten to power through accidents of birth, but power once held was disguised and made gentle by the decorum of the court. The common people would have an uneasy relationship with aristocratic refinement and the air of grandeur that prevents it from being communicated, but they'd respect, he said, that the drapery of elegant manners, refined tastes, and graceful phrases would cover the depravity of great noblemen. He contrasted this aristocratic refinement with democratic societies and their apparently open access to power and wealth, meaning that citizens would always look askance at those who had achieved those things, wondering what sorts of vicious machinations were at play. For, quote, there is less reason to fear the sight of the immorality of the great than that of immorality leading to greatness. Mutual comparison is the fly in the ointment of democracy, and democratic citizens would always be suspicious of fellow citizens who rose through the ranks. They would wonder how he who was their equal yesterday has today won the right to command them. And since attributing his rise to his talents or his virtues is inconvenient, for it means admitting that they are less virtuous or capable than he is, they would assume the rise resulted from vice and not virtue. The impulse to compare creates a permanent fault line in our politics. For the divisions in social and economic classes would now require self-interested explanations. For those on the bottom, getting to the top could only result from vice, and those at the top would regard themselves as winning the competitive sweepstakes, what Michael Young disparagingly called the meritocracy. Lash observed that, quote, social mobility does not undermine the influence of elites. If anything, it helps to solidify their influence by supporting the illusion that it rests solely on merit. It merely strengthens the likelihood that elites will exercise power irresponsibly, precisely because they recognize so few obligations to their predecessors or to the communities they profess to lead. Tocqueville made the counterintuitive claim that class divisions were more intractable in democracies than they were in aristocracies. The acids of comparison eroded the strength of the chains that bound the classes together, and those acids intensified precisely because of the perceived mobility between classes. Class members now became contemptuous of those in other classes, envious of success, and dismissive of failure. Everyone ended up where they were in the social hierarchy, either through their merits or through their weaknesses. Mutual dependency between the classes was displaced by rivalry. He wrote, aristocratic institutions have the effect of linking each man closely with others, defining their obligations to everyone regardless of status. Their stations may be fixed, but their duties are fluid. While in democracies, the stations are fluid, but devoted service to any individual much rarer. In democracies, Tocqueville argued, the bonds of human affection are wider but more relaxed, and the woof of time is ever being broken and the tack of past generations lost. Life in an aristocracy links everyone from peasant to king in one long chain. Democracy breaks the chain and frees each link. Tocqueville saw that the breaking of this chain unbound the generations from one another, leading us to forget our ancestors and cloud our view of our descendants. There are two related aspects to this analysis. The first relates to the very nature of human aspirations. Lash, Tocqueville, Ortega, and many other thinkers spotted democracy's fatal flaw. It untethered in people the desire for material well-being. Comfort, security, and the acquisition of goods would become the animating concern of democratic peoples. It becomes, Tocqueville believed, their ruling passion, and they would expect government to secure these goods, leading them to become dependent on the government rather than on one another. One of the great debates during the constitutional period involved concerns about luxury, that is, excessive wealth and its conspicuous display, and its effect on the polity. David Hume, a significant influence on Federalist thinkers, defended the idea of luxury, arguing it was a word of uncertain signification that could be taken in a good as well as a bad sense. Rather than seeing luxury as a form of decadence, he saw it in its proper sense, as a refining of people's tastes and a strengthening of their morals. For, as he wrote, the ages of refinement are both the happiest and the most virtuous. Luxury, Hume continued, allowed for the development of the refined arts that allowed men to become more sociable, flocking into cities so they can show their wit or their breeding and display their taste in conversation or living. A commercial society, the Anti-Federalists claimed, contrary to Hume, had greater levels of material inequality and encouraged the bane of luxury. The Anti-Federalist Cato had worried, quote, that the progress of a commercial society begets luxury, the parent of inequality, the foe to virtue, and the enemy to restraint. Juvenal, during the French Revolution, reflecting during the French Revolution, identified as one of its causes luxury, more cruel than a foeman's arms fell upon us, and is avenging the conquered world. In his The Old Regime and the French Revolution, Tocqueville argued that, quote, the craving for material being leads the way to servitude. That craving, he believed, was morally debilitating and can be singularly tenacious and insidious, often attaching itself to private virtues, such as family love, a sense of decorum, and a respect for religion. It excels, he claimed, in making people well-behaved, but mean-spirited. And this disease infected rich and poor alike. But smugness became the special vice of the elite. In a meritocratic society, the elite, having won the sweepstakes, indulged the tendency to look down on their inferiors, even while paying compassionate lip service to the downtrodden. Tocqueville identified this tendency as a decisive factor leading to the French Revolution. Quote, we must admit that notwithstanding these expressions of goodwill and despite a genuine desire to better the condition of the poorer classes, the feelings of the elite towards them were strongly tinctured by contempt. He buttressed this claim by quoting documents wherein the French elite referred to the lower classes as uncouth yokels. I don't know what that is in French. I thought yokel was an American term, but thereby he wrote, speaking its authentic tongue and showing its true colors. Thus, Tocqueville observed, it was precisely the parts of France that had shown the most material improvement where the spirit of discontent ran hottest. The violence of the revolution, he claimed, was intensified by the habit of the cultured elite keeping to themselves. Their isolation became their undoing. As to the lower classes, quote, during the many centuries in which these men had borne the brunt of nationwide mismanagement and lived as a class apart, they had nursed in secret their grievances, jealousies, and rancors, and having learned toughness in a hard school, had become capable of enduring or inflicting the very worst. In 2016 and 2017, commentators among the elite expressed shock at the populist revolt taking place across Western Europe and North America. They need not have, for populist movements often occur during periods of rapidly increasing income inequality and social unrest. The elites, having insulated themselves from the consequences of their mistakes and having disparaged those below them, maybe most especially in their separation of learning from labor, found themselves now led by the very person they belittled. I think maybe a fair way of putting it is they got the leader they deserved. And this is how it goes with populist uprisings. They have been a constant throughout history and always begin when the elite begin to isolate themselves and then look down upon others. There are other fairly constant elements in populist revolts that also bear mentioning. I'll pass over their tendency to indulge in conspiracy theories, or to be anti-intellectual, or nativist, or suspicious of cosmopolitans, or to be distrustful of science and technology. Although that latter might bear a quick mention, because for all their supposed lack of learning, populists tend to recognize that science and technology emerges in a social context and is not applied neutrally. They see these developments not only as opportunities for elite control, but as practices and instruments whose benefits are distributed unequally. Tocqueville said it is the goal of every tyrant to keep people as separated from each other as possible. This relates to populist suspicion of so-called progress, for those on the bottom often pay the price for someone else's progress. There are three other common features of populism that I think are worth exploring. One can be dealt with briefly, and that is that persons in populist movements tend to be quite religious. As the elites become more secular and the non-elites either more religious or sustain their levels of religiosity, we can expect the intensity of populist discontent to increase, since the stakes get significantly higher. The repeated warnings in the pages of the New York Times and in a spate of recent books about the looming threat of theocracy indicates the levels of elite fear. Been a bunch of books written about this lately, that America is on the cusp of becoming a theocracy. A second feature worth mentioning is that populist elite controversies often track along urban-rural divides. Elites concentrate in cities, where the bulk of wealth and power reside, and are very skilled at clustering, both geographically and institutionally. The people who make up populist movements tend to be quite dispersed and possessed of fewer resources, including the ability to organize and actuate themselves politically. On those occasions when they do gather, their resentment can easily devolve to violence, particularly if they are in the presence of elites. There's a third feature that hasn't gotten enough attention. Especially in America, populist movements have arisen in response to perceived corruptions in the banking system. Already in the early republic, Hamilton's plan for a national bank met with great objections from the more democratically minded Jeffersonians. Andrew Jackson's populism found its most trenchant expression in his vetoing of the national bank. In his veto message, he wrote this: "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to those natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humbler members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." We have yet to come to grips with the fallout from and the resentments generated in the financial collapse of 2008. These failings in the financial system cost lower and middle class citizens millions in forfeited assets, while those responsible for the collapses either escaped harm or actually emerged with more wealth. A person believing herself to be a victim of the predatory lending practices that led to the 2008 collapse would no doubt remain piqued by the subsequent bailouts and lack of prosecution of the architects of the disaster. Then, too, populist movements tend to arise during periods of rapid social change. The stress created by all the vertiginous alterations of social life often leaves groups grasping for a return to traditional forms and ways of life. This reactionary response to progress becomes intensified when the mechanisms for and justifications of progress find a home in the centralized administrative state. In such a situation, people experience themselves as helpless and insignificant. They feel buffeted by forces outside their control. Tocqueville identified this feeling of powerlessness as a source not only of the revolution, but of its violence. Furthermore, because of how remote and powerful the state seems to be, populist movements lose interest in what we call normal politics. Political institutions, now completely suspect, can only be addressed in extreme ways. Perhaps nowhere do we see this more clearly than in the widespread suspicions about our voting systems. Nor have we touched on the problem of disconnectedness. The decline of non-coastal places has had a disastrous effect on our politics. Not only disconnected from the central government, but disconnected from one another and from their places, many of which the commentator Kevin Williamson opined ought to be left to die. Deracinated people become easy prey to tribalist impulses. A man is more likely to mind his own business if his business is worth minding. And as Hannah Arendt observed, the rootless are always violent. What's different and interesting about contemporary populism is that it is not connected to any program for governing. It is a negative reaction resulting from the fact that people are convinced that they'll never get the chance to rule. And so they want to annoy and infuriate as much as they can the people who do. They've given up thinking that politics will work for them. Their political gestures largely devolve to theatrical performance because they believe the whole system has drifted away from the central concerns of their lives. Blanche offers a more affirming vision of populism, one still untainted by the events of the last 20 years. It is a democratic vision in an affirmative sense. Because of their engagement with real things, Blanche's populists develop an appreciation for limits and the unrelenting logic supporting them. They also engage in small-scale proprietary experiments rather than trying to do things on a large scale. They are more interested in useful callings than in remunerative ones. They govern themselves and their communities prudently. They operate with a guarded hope instead of cockeyed optimism, and they demonstrate a stoic self-discipline in their lives. These are the people, Lash claims, who, because of their ability to sustain concrete commitments, can make democracy work. The integration of the global economy has exerted downward pressure that leads to instability and disintegration in certain places. And this economy only becomes possible with yet another object of populist disdain: money. One recalls William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech as an example of reacting against powerful interests, manipulating money to their advantage and to the disadvantage of other groups. The anti-federalists worried that the move to a cash economy would undermine Republican virtue. And long before Marx, Tocqueville expressed concern that money would act as a solvent on all social relations, including class relations. In some ways, the central problem of America has become the problem of liquidity. Wealth, energy, even the self have all lost their solidity. The flow of money has had a profoundly corrosive effect on our financial institutions, but also on our social ones. The financial, rather than the productive sector, now occupies the lion's share of our economic activity. Our dependence on liquid energy has created enormous political, environmental, strategic, and social hazards. Even the self is seen as fluid, a constantly moving stream of unstable identity. One of my favorite lines in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he says, in a democracy, everything is unstable, but the most unstable thing of all is the human heart. Everything is fluid. Wealth, siphoned away from places where people used to make and grow things, flows to urban centers that engage in financial speculation. Young adults follow the flow of capital. Our colleges largely operating as sorting mechanisms that send children away from the places of their birth to follow the money. Politically, our Constitution no longer operates on the principle of limited government, but as a fluid adaptation to changing mores. Critics complain when the system of checks and balances actually works. The cash nexus, as Robert Nisbet argued, dissolves social institutions as well as personal identity. Where cash flows, looseness becomes inevitable. We become people who, in Nisbet's words, hang loose upon the world. Uprooted and disconnected, we become competitive rather than cooperative. Tocqueville predicted economic and professional competition would increase as institutions weakened, because the marketplace would be the arena for proving our worth. Reduced to the mass of equal, alike, and atomized beings, we come to regard ourselves as replaceable and inconsequential. This realization results in anxiety and lawlessness, the self burdened with creating its own meaning. The temptation in those circumstances to immerse the self in mass movements occurs simultaneously with its retreat into itself, making us, in Tocqueville's words, more than kings and less than men. The public realm becomes a competition for status and material well-being, and the home becomes a refuge for restless souls that can never achieve enough. But bereft of its economic function, even the home loses its ability to articulate norms and shape our sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. Young people, as a result, are left to make their way in the world. And that way is typically away from home. Adulthood means independence, the emancipation of the young person from the strictures and structures of nurturing home and community. We underestimate how frightening this prospect is, not only because a young person is deprived of essential psychic supports, but also because our value now hinges on the perceptions of others who did not grow up with us and don't really care for us. The instability of a democratic society, coupled with the destructive features of industrial capitalism, necessarily results in significant changes in the way we make life decisions. Because money is an inherently unstable store of value, even as it monopolizes the medium of exchange, it becomes virtually impossible to plan for the future. Additionally, because money is fungible and allows for the exchange of labor for goods, it encourages consumerism. Tocqueville thought democratic man was made mad by his taste for material gratification. When the distinctions of ranks are obliterated and privileges are destroyed, when hereditary property is subdivided and education and freedom are widely diffused, the desire of acquiring the comforts of the world haunts the imagination of the poor, and the dread of losing them, that of the rich. Our crisis of leadership, I have argued, arises from three sources. First and most importantly is the separation of a leadership class from the people they're supposed to lead, exacerbated by contempt. Earning back their trust will be impossible without sharing in their fate and their misfortunes. A second source is the rise of a centralized administrative state, whereby average citizens experience themselves as being at the mercy of anonymous powers. When these powers are put into the hands of elites who will then use those powers to reward friends and punish enemies, the pitchforks will soon come out. A third source for the crisis of leadership is the desire for material comfort and the role of money in securing it. Tocqueville referred to this as a soft despotism that would turn democratic peoples into timid and industrious sheep with government as their shepherd. What now? I want to suggest that there is a single tonic for all three causes, and that it was what used to be regarded as an essential feature of leadership: restraint. This strict ethical discipline is a common feature among all great leaders and a common feature of the polities they lead. It is opposed to the imperial impulse that results in unrestrained appetite, either personally or politically. It requires the right proportions of boldness and humility, of realism and vision, of limits and liberty. The crisis of leadership will not be solved by propagandistic promise-making, by scientific expertise, or by a cult of personality. It can only be solved by discerning the character and people that we actually know, live with, and admire. Thank you. I will take whatever questions you have. They don't even have to be about the speech. I made a joke at dinner last night I probably shouldn't repeat, right? The people who were at dinner last night, I probably shouldn't repeat the joke. Is that right? About questions I will answer? Thank you. Like how to defend a Hail Mary? Yeah. Too soon?
Thank you for that really interesting lecture. I wonder if you could offer us 3 kinds of examples from the lecture. And you had invited possible questions about the current election. So I wonder if you can offer examples of the kind of problematic populism in both the left and the right now, the Democrats and the Republicans,
Okay.
especially how they're kind of their candidacies. And I wonder if you could offer then a more affirmative account of populism that you associate with Lash. What does that look like, especially under the conditions of liquidity, as you called it?
Great question. The first part of the question, how does it look on both the left and the right? There are common elements: mutual suspicion, anger, distrust. And on the right is in some sense more interesting to me theoretically, because it's atavistic in a lot of ways. One of the interesting things about January 6th was the dress and symbols employed by the people who invaded the Capitol. There's a lot of paganism going on there. And so this is a kind of common observation among the right, that this kind of extreme right-wing populism is very tribalistic. It's kind of paganistic in its impulse. And there's a lot of violent imagery that takes place. I think we're rightly concerned about it. The populism on the left is of a slightly different sort, because I think it is that there's still the economic element. I thought Bernie Sanders was a really interesting advent in the Democratic Party, and we know exactly what the Democratic Party did to Bernie Sanders. The Republicans would have liked to have done that to Donald Trump, but they don't have the skill or the capacity to do things like that. But I think the Bernie Sanders kind of impulse on the left is still there, which is not as suspicious of government as what you find on the right. It's simply a kind of seizing of the controls of it. The answer to your second question is the populism that Lash envisions is a populism that concerns itself only tangentially with national politics. Its focus is on local politics. Its idea would be that we can govern effectively with one another if we have mutual interests. So think about, when people ask me what political issue is most important to you, I'll say, it's slowing down the traffic on my street. There are a lot of children in our neighborhood, and we get cars ripping down our street far too frequently. How do we slow down the traffic? I don't want to see a kid killed. Man, that's more important to me than a lot of what gets talked about in Washington, and more important to my neighbors than what gets talked about in Washington. My neighbors on both sides, my neighbor across the street, I could not begin to tell you how they voted in presidential elections. We don't care. We just care whether we're good neighbors or not. And so I think that one of the things we have to do in our politics is try to figure out, what are the basic units of political life? Well, the household, look at Aristotle, the household is a basic unit of political life, the neighborhood, the city. The empire is a kind of deviation of what good politics looks like. I think it's a relocating of focus in the kind of populism Lash envisions. These are people who live in mutually dependent relationships with one another, right? My neighbor John, he can't. This may sound strange to people in Texas, but in Michigan we have this thing called snow, and we get a lot of it. And you can't get out of your garage unless you clear off your driveway. And my neighbor John can't clear out his driveway. Somebody's got to do it. The government's not going to do it. So we do it. When my kids were younger, And, for some reason, I couldn't be home when they got home from school. They would go to John's house and they would have cookies and play a game with them. So, and that's the kind of thing, it sounds a little romantic maybe, but it's not. I mean, there are still communities where people live that way in these relationships of mutual dependence. And I think that's Lash's vision. So it's this process of decentralization, of making local politics the most important politics, what in the Catholic tradition we call subsidiarity. Right? The decisions should be made by people closest to the point of decision making.
We'd love to have questions from students.
Is that Jay who's going to ask me a question?
Thank you for the talk today. I really appreciated what you mentioned briefly, Bernie Sanders, to the last question, and what happened with him, the Democratic Party, when he was running for president twice. We hear this phrase a lot in national elections, like, you got to vote for the lesser of two evils. People pitted against a fight between two evils, and you just got to pick the best one. For instances like that example with Bernie Sanders, how do we, as the average voters, people not directly involved in politics, like actually politicians, what do we do to make sure there's a candidate on the stage, since there's really only two options, that we actually think agree with the policies that we want initiated?
One of the big problems in our politics right now is our primary system. Another problem in our politics is districting. And that's actually a more difficult problem to fix than people think it is. But it's a problem. The primary systems are quite broken. And, I think that we witnessed that in both parties in 2016. I mean, the Democrats ended up with the candidate they wanted. But, had they not done what they did, it's quite possible that Bernie would have won that nomination. The Republicans definitely did not end up with the candidate they wanted. But again, the kind of rules of each party's nominating process made it possible for something like that to happen. So, parties are not my area of expertise, but there are scholars who recommend reforms that could perhaps fix the primary system. I mean, the nominating process got democratized in the 20th century. I think it would be hard to make the argument that it was made better because of it, that we're actually ending up with better candidates because of it. Dr. Corey mentioned that I work at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. I take it to Ford's credit that he was never elected to the office, either the presidency or the vice presidency. Maybe there's something to be said for that.
Pass that down.
I should, while the microphone's being passed, by the way, I should point out that Ford was Nixon's third choice for vice president. And that only happened after a delegation of Democrats and Republicans from Congress went to Nixon and said, just so you know, there's only one name we will accept. And that's Gerald Ford, because he had a reputation for unimpeachable personal character and integrity. Unimpeachable, I use that word intentionally.
Hi, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us this evening. My question is, I guess, has some context to it. So I was talking to a friend recently, and we were discussing whether we considered ourselves to be elitist or populist in our politics. Both of us were more inclined toward what you could describe as a populist side. But then we also ended up having different political, associating ourselves with different political parties. And it seems to me more broadly that there is this sense in which both people like both Democrats and Republicans of a certain kind see the other as being part of the elite and as therefore the problem. And so it seems to me that not only are there two different versions of populism, left and right, but that both of those versions in a way look at the other as being the problem. And in many ways, what's even more interesting to me about that dichotomy is that often because often there are still strands in the Republican Party that advocate for certain kinds of policies that could definitely still be associated with a kind of favoring for the elite. The same could be said for the Democrat Party. So it's almost as though the parties themselves are divided on what policies would be beneficial for either a elite constituency or a populist one. So in terms of looking toward the future, in addition to restraint, would you say that, do you see any possibility for a kind of political realignment that instead of having flip sides of both populist and elite interests on both parties, aligns it in such a way that one party becomes almost identical with the interest in one class and vice versa?
That's a great question. So this is a thing in political science we call realignment theory, and that's the circumstances under which political parties will begin to alter their coalitions. If you understand political parties simply as coalitions of different groups, these get altered under certain circumstances. And in the past, populist movements in America have forced some sort of realignment of the parties. I think you're right that it would be a mistake to view the elites as one party and populists as another party. I think that's a mistake, because I don't think that's the way the populists view it. Right? They think both parties are maybe varying degrees of culpability, but both culpable in the problems. Now, I didn't mention COVID, but that's a big deal. Because there were certain kinds of professions and so forth where working remotely had no economic impact on them. There are other kinds of professions where the shutdowns had a profound economic impact on them, and and that percolates into the politics. I think we're seeing it happening. What you suggested might happen. I think we're seeing it happening. The party coalitions are changing, and the fact that Donald Trump has been the Republican candidate not once, not twice, but 3 times now is an indication that the most extreme version of that populist impulse has found its home in the Republican Party. I don't know what the long-term consequences of that are going to be, but I expect that the kind of migration of the lower classes and the laboring classes to the Republican Party will continue.
One more question, which I have, and then I'm going to make sure there's time for Dr. Polet to stand around a little bit if he'll be so generous, and just take some other questions off the cuff from students. Okay, go ahead.
What do you like?
Well, I kind of like stole my question a little bit, but I'll kind of ask it from a different perspective, kind of from the social perspective instead of political side. You mentioned that restraint was a big part of having a leader, but in a social and I guess political climate that we have now, that restraint isn't often seen. And for this next generation, as we grow up, would you say there's a possibility that this type of social climate and landscape could produce a leader with that restraint to be a viable candidate?
I mean, I hope so. I'm not sanguine about it. So if you look at some significant pieces of evidence of this lack of restraint, I mean, we could see it in the lives of Americans, right? The increasing amount of revolving credit that they're accumulating debt with. People consistently spending beyond their means. But at the macro level, you've got a national government that by any definition of imperial is imperial. And is not shy about sticking its nose in other people's business, in the business of other nations. Nor do we have a national government that seems to have any concern about spending like a bunch of drunken sailors. Right? What's not even a topic in this campaign, nor the previous campaign, the national debt. It is the biggest problem in this country today, and no one is talking about it. No one is talking about it. So to go to your question, you say, well, if we had a candidate who actually talked about it, that would be a good start, and would say something like, maybe $37 trillion of debt is not a great idea. Maybe spending close to $1 trillion annually on interest payments on the debt is not a great idea. I mean, it's now a quarter of the federal budget is spent on servicing the debt. And that means other goods and services can't be procured by the federal government. No one's talking about it. So what I worry about is that necessity is a hard master, right? I mean, if you get to the point, so predictions are that the US reaches a fiscal cliff in 2030. And the longer we wait to correct our spending habits, the higher the price we'll have to pay for them. But the people we elect to political office apparently have no incentive to do anything about it or to address it. And this goes back to the claim that I was making, or that Tocqueville was making, that Americans are obsessed with material comfort. And if you ran for office, like Paul Tsongas did back in '88, I think it was, or '92, Tsongas ran for office, and recommended a certain amount of austerity, maybe we have to lower our standards of living a little bit. Good luck, you'll never get elected. Right? You've got zero chance of getting elected right now. So you keep making empty promises, you keep spending more and more money, you keep operating without restraint. And at some point, it has to stop. And my concern is that we try to figure out how to soften the landing as much as we possibly can. Because if you think our politics is divisive now, introduce scarcity into our politics and see what happens. And we'll get ugly in a hurry. So to go back to your question, I hope we can. And I hope we can before we have to. But in some ways, I'm afraid, it's like Macbeth, at this point, I'm so far steeped in blood, it's just easier to go forward than to turn back. I think it's the way the federal government is about debt, I might as well just keep spending. No, we haven't collapsed yet. So, but it's going to put a burden on the young people in this room, that's for sure.
On that shiny note, I want to take it over to Doug Henry here to take us to the next step.
Join me, please, in thanking Dr. Polet.
Okay.
When Jeff told me his title was Getting What We Deserve, my response was, that can't possibly be true. The thing is, the we is us collectively. And if we want to get better leaders in America or Mexico or Canada, in Great Britain, in France, in Turkey, in Israel, we've got to be better. And that puts a responsibility on each of us. And so I commend to each of you, especially our students, a vision for a more sober-minded, more virtuous political life, beginning in the neighborhoods that you occupy, that is expressed in the friendships that you cultivate, that is given expression in quiet, but nonetheless powerfully transformative investments in those who are close at hand. There's nothing to do when there's work at hand but to roll up your sleeves and start. Waiting does not get anything done. So to work we go. But before we go to work, Hannah Brick is going to come forward and offer a concluding thank you and welcome that will issue forth in a wonderful time of fellowship and sweetness down the hall. Hannah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah Brick. I'm a senior here at Baylor. I just have the honor of thanking Dr. Polet again for such a wonderful speech. I think it really emphasized one of the most important ideals I've learned at Baylor, which is not to be told what to think, but instead to take a lot of nuance and practice how I think about issues. So thank you again. I invite all of you guys to join us down straight out these doors and to the left for a little light refreshments and desserts. Thank you.
didn't say anything about the QR code, but it is on the, it is on the.
You told me, I wrote it down.
It's fine.
Those who it's important.
They should see it when they walk out.